What's up, everybody? Happy Saturday. Welcome into the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can always follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Today, my main topic of discussion is going to be the Packers' biggest areas of need. And this is a question that I've kind of gotten a lot recently is, what do the Packers most need in the draft? What do they most need to address? And I think for the most part, people have very easily figured out on their own: offensive line, defensive line, cornerback. All of those are positions that Green Bay could use help with in some capacity. But taking a look at both the short term and the long term, how would you rank the Packers' positions and figure out where the biggest areas of need are overall? So today I figured I would just put it out there and I will go through every position and label them from least need to most need at the end, and we'll kind of go from there. So to start off, I'm not going to go over special teams here, right? They need to get better on special teams, and they could use competition at punter. They could use competition at long snapper, and I think Mason Crosby is probably going to be the kicker again this year. Don't think that's a bold take there, so probably don't need to invest in a kicker or anything, but not going to spend too much time on special teams. So let's go the 10 positions one by one from, again, the least needed to the most needed. And number 10, I don't think is going to surprise anyone here, is quarterback. The least needed position right now. You've got your current, Hall of Fame MVP quarterback in Aaron Rodgers. And then hopefully, the heir apparent in Jordan Love. So, they could absolutely spend a resource on day 3 on a potential developmental number 3 quarterback. That's absolutely within the realm of possibility. Should they? Could they? Who knows, right? But it's definitely something that they could look at on day 3. But this is not a need in any way, shape, or form for Green Bay. I'm not even going to go into it too much. You know why. They have the current, they have hopefully the future, and basically they can't spend another top resource on a quarterback. Like, they already got fairly ridiculed by almost everyone, media, fans alike, for taking a quarterback. Whether they should or not, is another story. But they got, ridiculed in a way for taking a quarterback last year. Taking another one this year, you can only imagine the feedback that they would get on that. So not that they're necessarily drafting for feedback, but it puts them in a tough position that, even if Trevor Lawrence falls to pick 29, the optics on taking another quarterback would be pretty rough. So number 10 is quarterback. Number 9, running back, and kind of for a similar reason, right? You've got your current Pro Bowl running back in Aaron Jones, and you've got what you hope is the heir apparent in A.J. Dillon. You've got a couple guys that are developmental players in a Patrick Taylor, a Dexter Williams. Again, same thing as quarterback. You can absolutely look on day 3 or an undrafted free agency for some players to come in and compete at that number 3 spot. I think if you wanted to look at more of a gadget player like a Tyler Ervin who can play some running back, kick return, punt return, maybe even play some in the slot, go for it. That's certainly still an area of need on this team, but I don't think it's a major need. It's arguably the lowest valued position in all of football right now. That's not a specialist position. And again, overall, I think Green Bay's pretty set at this position. So a firm number 9 at running back. Number 8 is tight end. And this is kind of a little bit of a sneaky, weird one, right? Because you think overall at tight end, you're like, well, they've got Bobby Tunyon, they've got Mercedes Lewis, they've got Jay Sternberger, they've got Josiah DeGuara, they've got Dominique Daphne, and you know what? DeGuara was a 3rd-round pick a season ago, Sternberger a 3rd-round pick 2 seasons ago, Tunyon probably should have been a Pro Bowler a season ago, Mercedes Lewis is the best blocking tight end in football. You put all that together, and Dominique Daphne had a pretty nice performance at the end of last year as well. You put all that together, and you're like, they're good. You do not need to put any more value into this position. Looking at it another way, Bobby Tunyon is on a 1-year restricted deal. Bringing him in next year, bringing him back is going to take a significant price, you would think, and they're going to be very, very strapped against the cap next season. Mercedes Lewis, he's kind of that nice blocking tight end. He's always going to be kind of that complimentary tight end, right? And he's getting up there in age. So yes, he's going to have a roster spot this year, but long-term, not a long-term answer for you. Jay Sternberger up to this point has not shown anything as to being a potential player on this team. Josiah DeGuara, more that H-back role, right? And same thing with Dominique Daphne. So if you're looking at true tight end, like a Bobby Tunyon, for example, somebody that can do a little bit of blocking, a little bit of receiving, being your true overall tight end, it's just Tunyon who's on a 1-year restricted deal that you really feel good about. Even Jay Sternberger, like he's probably more of your move, tight end. That's going to be more of your pass catching tight end, even if he develops as you would hope. So I don't think this is a position that Green Bay needs to spend big on, but it's a really interesting position. I would address it in the future. I wouldn't address it now because there are still too many variables up in the air, but it's a little bit more of an interesting one than I think maybe people think of at first glance. Number 7 is edge rusher. And this is, again, another really sneaky one because this is likely Preston Smith's last year with the Packers unless he comes back on a much cheaper deal. They'd have to basically release or restructure him. We'll see. But it could very well be his last year in Green Bay. Zadarius Smith has a rubber meets the road contract where they can't pay him what he's set to make right now. So it's going to have to be something where they either extend him or release him. Of course, you have Rashawn Gary. And then it's a bunch of question marks, right? You have a Jonathan Garvin as probably the next most talented guy on the roster, but I still think it's not a huge, certainly not a huge need now. Like I feel very comfortable going into this season. If you said the top 4 edge rushers in Green Bay are going to be Preston, Zadarius, Rashawn Gary, and Jonathan Garvin, and then you have a Tipa Naliai as well, who is kind of a unique developmental guy. I feel very comfortable going into the season with those 5 players. Randy Ramsey, of course, as well. If they didn't add another player, I wouldn't feel concerned in any way, shape, or form. But you usually, again, Green Bay's philosophy is get somebody before you need them. If for some reason the salary cap structure, sets up next year where they need to move on from Preston and something happens with Zadarius and you can't bring him back, like now you have Rashawn Gary and like a Jonathan Garvin and a Tipa Naliai. You could use somebody else here. I still think you would address it next year or, into the future rather than now. If they spent an early pick on an edge rusher, it wouldn't shock me, especially with some of the players that are available. Carlos Basham could make a lot of sense for them, but I don't think this is a major need for Green Bay right now. And I still think even going into next year, who knows what happens with Garvin and Naliai, but even next year, if you said, you're going to start with Zadarius and Rashawn Gary and Tipa and Garvin were your 2 backups, it'd be like, listen, Green Bay's had a lot worse edge rusher groups than that in the past. So not a huge need, but one you could certainly address going into the future. Number 6 is safety. And again, I don't think this is a major need. I think Vernon Scott's a really interesting piece here. I think Henry Black is a really interesting piece. Will Redmond is a top special teams player for them and wasn't brutal when he got out on the field either. And then, of course, you've got Adrian Amos and Darnell Savage. This is still a position where I think Green Bay can go early. I mentioned this with Javon Holland the other day, where you could use somebody that's maybe a safety / slot player and can kind of play a hybrid role, give you some depth there as well. I do think, you take a major hit if either Savage or Amos go down for any extended period. I think if Vernon Scott or Henry Black have to play significant minutes or a Will Redmond, I think there's definitely a huge decrease there. So having a little bit more depth and somebody, again, who can still get on the field in your passing situations as like a slot type star player, I think there's a lot of value there. So I don't necessarily, again, think it's a top need, but adding one more player into that mix, into the competition, somebody that could play some in the slot, I think could have some real value for Green Bay. Number 5 is wide receiver. And this, again, is a really interesting one. You have Devante Adams. He's on the last year of his deal. I think we all expect something to get worked out at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later, where they extend him out. You have Alan Lazard, who is going to sign his exclusive rights free agent tender this year, will be a restricted free agent next year. So they still have his rights. And then you've got a bunch of guys that are coming off a contract, Devin Funchess, EQ, MVS. And ultimately at this moment, as we speak right now, there's no real player that's had any playing time that's on the roster that's on a contract next year. So definitely a position long-term that could use some juice. Also, as we talked about, getting somebody who can play that slot gadget role used on the jet sweeps, the end arounds, the reverses, the motions, the orbits, even handed off to in the backfield, kick returner, punt returner. They don't have that guy. So that is still a need, in my opinion, on this roster. And again, just getting younger and getting more talented at the position is certainly something that both short-term and long-term could help this team out. So number 5, wide receiver. Number 4 on my list is linebacker. And this is, again, all of these have a degree of nuance to them, right? Like they could feel really good about Chris Barnes and Kamal Martin. And they could feel like, we're good. Like Ty Summers is fine as a number 3. We feel good about the top 2. Oren Burks can be a 4, knowing that he can be a core special teams guy. Like we feel pretty good going into this season. To me, Chris Barnes and Kamal Martin are good competition guys. And again, I really like Chris Barnes. I think he has an opportunity to really make it in this league and be a really nice player. But if you can add some juice and some, again, some tenacity, somebody that can get sideline to sideline, somebody that can play all three downs, somebody that can maybe shed from a guard when needed, like there's like literally Micah Parsons probably, and that's about it in this draft that can do those things I just mentioned, who will be long gone at 29. But my point being, this is a position that can still use some competition and some high-end play. And we haven't seen Green Bay spend a lot of premium draft picks on this position. So getting somebody in there that could play it at a very high level. We've seen some of the other teams that have had the speed at linebacker and what it affords those defenses to do. I still think this is a pretty big need for Green Bay. And if all of a sudden that bumps Chris Barnes to your number 2 linebacker and Kamal Martin to your number 3 and Summers as your 4 and Burks as your 5, so be it. So I still think this is a position that Green Bay can absolutely target. At the same token, your roster's young. If they feel good about Barnes and Martin and those are your 2 guys, all right, so be it. Go with it and see if you can get by with it and supplement everything else. But I still think it's a position that could use some love. Number 3 is corner. I don't think I need to go into too much detail here. Right now, Kevin King's going to start on one side. Chandon Sullivan probably still in the slot. You've got some interesting players in a Josh Jackson, a KB Anento, Stanford Samuels, players like that. But really short-term and long-term, it's Jair Alexander and a bunch of question marks that every time they step on the field, you're going to wonder what type of game you're going to get out of it. So adding more competition to that room, and everyone else is, Jackson's in the last year of his deal, King's in the last year of his deal, Sullivan's in the last year of his deal. So you look at all of it, it's Jair Alexander and basically nobody in 2022. In 2021, it's Jair Alexander and a bunch of question marks. So adding some competition and some talent to that room, you can't go wrong there. Number 1 and 2, I went back and forth again. Number 2, I ended up with offensive line, and this could easily be number 1. But think of this long term. Over the next couple seasons, I had actually incorrectly spoke a couple episodes ago when I said Billy Turner is likely to be released next year. Looking at his contract in further detail, and thanks for the person who pointed this out to me on Twitter, looking at his contract in further detail, I think it's actually much more likely the way they structured it that Billy Turner is on the team in 2022. Based on the savings, it's just better off to keep him. So you've got Bakhtiari for the foreseeable future. You've got Billy Turner this year and next year. You've got Jenkins for the foreseeable future. You've got John Runyon Jr. for the foreseeable future. You've got 4 of your spots set for at least this year and next year. And Lucas Patrick, you've got set for this year. So you can make, and then you've got some wild cards too, right? Like a Simon Stepaniak specifically. So you've got some players here that have some upside and can fill those holes. And it's not like you need a total makeover of the offensive line, right? We're talking about maybe a starter and then a depth piece. That being said, I do still think this offensive line needs an infusion of depth. It was so important to the Packers this season ago, and losing Corey Linsley and Rick Wagner and Lane Taylor, in my opinion, is a really big deal. So yes, you could have guys like John Runyon Jr. and Simon Stepaniak step up, and Lucas Patrick play similarly to how he did a season ago. Billy Turner, same thing. David Bakhtiari bounced back from injury. All in Elton Jenkins continue to progress on what looks like a really impressive career. All of those things are true. I just think addressing that depth and maybe adding one more starting caliber player could go a long way. In my opinion, if you give Aaron Rodgers and Matt LaFleur a good offensive line, especially with Devante Adams and Aaron Jones, but even without those guys, if you give Rodgers and LaFleur an amazing offensive line to open up holes in the running game for whatever running back you have and protect Rodgers in the passing game, they can make magic with everything else. So build the O-line. Everything else on offense is going to work with Rodgers and LaFleur. And last but not least, defensive line, which I've been banging the drum on for years now, last 3 years at least. Again, I shudder to think what happens if Kenny Clark goes down for any extended period of time. You cannot get by with Tyler Lancaster and Dean Lowry and Kingsley Keke as your top 3. If he suffers some sort of major injury, and he's played quite a few snaps these last few seasons, right? If he suffers any sort of major injury, you're really in a bind at that position. Furthermore, get the dude some help. He is doing some insane heavy lifting on his own. Dean Lowry, Tyler Lancaster, Kingsley Keke, these guys can be rotational pieces. You don't want them having to play 40, 50, 60 snaps per game. And maybe Keke gets there, right? Maybe he gets there. But if he doesn't, again, it's Clark and a bunch of average rotational guys. getting him some help would go an insanely long way. And adding to your defensive line helps everyone else. It helps your edge rushers because pockets are collapsing on the inside, allowing them, more time and more ability to get to the quarterback so they can't just step up in the pocket. It allows your linebackers to play faster and quicker because those offensive linemen are getting to the second level. It opens up everything for your defense. And obviously better pass rush means better coverage. It helps everything. So Kenny Clark's had to do a lot of that heavy lifting. And by the way, I think you add a good tag team partner in there. I think you see Kenny Clark's production go way, way up as well because it doesn't, you can't focus as much just on Kenny Clark on the defensive line. So again, to recap, quarterback, running back, tight end, edge, safety, wide receiver, linebacker, corner, offensive line, and defensive line in that order from least important to most important to address. Thanks so much for joining me. Appreciate it as always. Make sure to check out today's audio podcast. I'll be right back here tomorrow. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.